Well, today we are going to have fun with a topic that I've called here the most reliable classic car V8 engine. And this one is sure to generate some controversy, especially amongst, well, some fans of other alternate makes. Now, this admittedly is tough. There's a lot of great V8 engines that were produced by the domestic automakers, by the way, including AMC, had a wonderful V8 of its own. AMC never made its own transmissions, but it did make its own engines. And the AMC V8 is a lovely little gem of an engine, very reliable, very peppy, but that's not the one that I'm thinking of here. Now, just to define reliability, I want to make a couple things clear. We're not just talking about the core engine itself, because a number of companies made great engines, but unfortunately, the engine itself was surrounded with, let's say, less than reliable components or components that were less reliable than competitive components. And as an example, let's take Chrysler vehicles with the early electronic ignition system. Wasn't all that great of a setup. It was designed to replace the points and be more reliable, provide better starting. But Chrysler's, unfortunately, and many Chrysler engines were equipped with subpar spark plugs that often made it hard for the engines to start, particularly in wet weather. The Champion and Prestolite plugs that came on a lot of Chryslers just were not all that great quality. And for those who are fans of this channel, you know that one of the first things I do when I get a Mopar engine is I replace the spark plugs, whatever's in it, with AC Delco regular plugs. And I guarantee if you've got a Mopar, the spark plug wire is going to cover it up and the exhaust manifold is going to cover it up anyway in the case of the big blocks. Put AC Delco plugs in, it will start and run far better than whatever else is in it if it doesn't have Delcos in it already. So that being said, Chrysler, as I was mentioning, doesn't make the list here. And that's in spite of them actually making many great V8 engines. The 440s, the big block engines, even the 318, the small block, they are wonderfully robust. They will last a long time in general. But unfortunately, they often had those components that just were not up to snuff, in particular the electronic ignition. Sometimes the carburation that was employed as well on Chryslers wasn't all that great. I don't think that anybody would say, as an example, the lean burn setup that Chrysler employed in the mid-1970s was overly reliable or well-engineered. Likewise, I would say the Carter thermoquad carburetors that came on a lot of those engines were not great either. Some came from the factory with Holley carburetors, which were okay. But in general, I would say the components on the Chrysler V8s were not as reliable as the components used by some other automakers, namely the ignitions as well as the carburetors. And the points-based ignitions on Chrysler vehicles were generally just fine. It was when they switched to electronic ignition, you better make sure that you carry a spare ballast resistor in your glove box, particularly for a rainy day, because they had a high likelihood of crapping out. And I remember even as a kid, you would often see Chrysler vehicles by the side of the road, specifically on rainy days, because for whatever reason, those were the days where some of the components just decided that they were going to give up the ghost at that particular point in time. So I will fully acknowledge Chrysler made excellent engines. By the way, over time, at least through the classic vehicle period, one could even make an argument that Chrysler engines and transmissions were the best. The 727 Torque Fight was fantastic, and really the engines themselves were great, as I mentioned before. But with all the components, they had some issues. Let's talk next about Ford. Now, Ford is not making the list here either because of, to some degree, the components similar to Chrysler. In particular, if you got a V8 engine with a 4-barrel carburetor from Ford from 1967 or later, I shouldn't say perpetually later, but for many, many years, you got an engine that was topped by the Autolite 4300 or 4350 carburetor, and that carburetor was just junk, frankly. Now, you could make the car more reliable by putting on a different carburetor, an aftermarket carburetor. But we're talking here about engines that came from the factory as being supremely reliable. And again, the Ford engines, the 385 series, the 429 cubic inch V8, the 460 V8, I think those are kind of the top of the notch in terms of reliability for classic car engines. The FE V8s were also great. The MEL V8s were generally great and very heavy and rugged engines. Ford did make some stinkers and ones that had teething issues, including, I would say, the original Y-block V8. But that one really just had oiling problems that could be solved with some external oil passages or making sure you change the oil very frequently. Regardless, many Ford engines, like I said, were quite reliable and durable. But that's the reason why the Fords don't quite make the list. And Ford electronic ignition, while better than Chrysler's, I would say, was not as good as GM's. If you want the best electronic ignition setup on a vintage vehicle, you're not going to look at Chrysler or Ford, but GM HEI was really the best setup of all the ignition systems at the time. Now, I must admit that Ford produced many V8 engines with a two-barrel carburetor, the Autolite 2100 in particular, and that was a great carburetor. But it was a little wheezy at the upper RPM ranges, and a lot of the engines that Ford made that were outfitted with it did have some issues. Like the 400 cubic inch V8s did have casting porosity issues. They had lower end issues in some years. So did the 351M engines. And the 351 Windsor, the 302 Windsor V8s, those are really, really good engines. I think probably my favorite, even more so than the Cleveland, if we're looking at the Ford small blocks. But as I mentioned, some of the other components on Fords, like the overall ignition setups, and you did tend to have some water pump issues on Fords every once in a while. You did tend to have some other issues associated with the engines. And as a consequence, I don't think that they're the most reliable. So that leaves General Motors. And yes, I do like General Motors classic vehicles, but as people who have watched the channel know, I own lots of non-GM cars, lots of Fords in particular. I have some Mopars, some AMCs, and I love them all. But let's talk about the GM engines. Now, somebody's going to say the small block Chevrolet V8 is an example. The most popular V8 of the GM V8s was produced for many years, from 1955 all the way through to the 2000s, and millions, tens of millions were sold in automotive applications, marine applications. But I would not put the small block V8 as the most reliable. And why is that? Well, the small block V8s from Chevrolet did tend to have water pump issues. The water pumps on them would fail, I would say, every 30, 40,000 miles. They weren't overly robust. Sometimes the fuel pumps weren't all that robust. The early small blocks, when it was first introduced in 1955, did have some teething problems, like many engines. But in general, some of the small block V8s suffered from some of the componentry failures that I mentioned that other automakers had, although different here. I think that for Chevrolet, really the Achilles heel for the engines was really the water pumps. And they also had a number of camshaft failures and soft cams for a number of years, particularly on the 305 engines. So the Chevrolet small block actually doesn't make the top of my list, although it is a good engine. Now, over at the Pontiac stable, we do have some very reliable engines, but Pontiac engines tended to have timing chain issues. A lot of cars and engines during this time had plastic timing gears, and Pontiac was one that used those for many, many years. And admittedly, so did other makes like Oldsmobile, and even Chrysler used it on some. Ford used it on some V8s. So it was a widespread usage of those plastic timing gears. But I think Pontiacs tended to fail the most often. And they also had water pump issues. Pontiacs also, I would say, tended to have a lot of starter issues. The starter was pretty proximate to the exhaust manifold, and they just didn't seem to last as long in Pontiacs as they did in other vehicles. I don't know what Pontiac did to the starter engineering over at Delco Remy division, but it didn't seem like any of the Pontiac V8s that I've had, I tend to replace the starters more frequently than I do in other cars. Some Pontiacs also had some valve train issues, some lifter issues, so they don't make the list. Let's keep going up the General Motors ladder to Oldsmobile. And Oldsmobile made some excellent V8 engines. In fact, Oldsmobile V8s were used in the GMC motorhomes. It was effectively the Oldsmobile Tornado powertrain that was dropped into the GMC motorhome. Yes, those motorhomes are front-wheel drive, virtually unaltered because they were so strong. So Oldsmobile did make great V8 engines, and they were often paired with great transmissions as well. Now, Oldsmobile did use that plastic timing gear on a lot of their engines. Some Oldsmobiles, in particular, a few of the high-performance 425 cubic inch engines did have some lifter issues. The Olds 403 small block did have some bottom end issues with the hollow main bearing webs. The Olds 455 was generally a great workhorse in the 425 and quite reliable overall and very durable. In fact, you don't tend to see a heck of a lot, I would say, of water pump issues on Oldsmobile V8s. I think you also tend to have less starter issues on those vehicles too. So they're really not bad. The Olds might be my second pick in terms of most reliable overall because their engines were tough, durable, long-lasting, and by and large, that applies to almost any Olds V8 that they made. The 403 might be the one exception, and the 403 was really just fine if you kept the RPM below 4,000. If you started going north of that, you were risking some sort of a catastrophic failure. So Oldsmobile's close, but no cigar. Now on to Buick. Buick also made a great V8, wonderfully smooth, and we could talk about the nailhead, we could talk about the later engine, the 430, and its various variations that came out in 1967. The 455 that came out in 1970 was produced for a number of years. But the Buick V8, at least the one from 1967 and later, did have some issues. The water pumps would fail. The oil pumps would sometimes have issues. They sometimes had internal oiling issues, particularly the early model years where they had the solid push rods where oil was not flowing through the push rods to the upper end of the engine. And in general, they had some issues, and I would say more issues than the other General Motors divisions. I would rank Buick overall reliability as an example below Oldsmobile, although they were really, really nice engines overall. So they are not at the top of my list. So that only leaves one General Motors division. And the top of my list, at least, is Cadillac. And in particular, the Cadillac V8 that was produced beginning in 1968 as a 472 and became the 500. Those variants, the 472 and the 500, I think are the most reliable engines. If I had to pick a classic car V8 that I was going to daily and drive across the country and not worry about it, I would pick a Cadillac with a 472 or 500. And yes, Cadillac did make the 425 cubic inch V8 from 1977 to 1979, the 368 cubic inch V8 in 1980 and 81 that was a variant of this engine. But the 425 had a lighter bottom end. It had some weight and cost taken out. It was a good engine. I just don't think it was good as good as the 472 and 500. And the 368, while it was certainly over-engineered because it was engineered to be a much larger engine, the V8 6.4 that came out in 1981, I think kind of did that one in terms of factory reliability. So why the 472 and 500? And I'll pin it on the 1968 to 1976 variants of these engines, although the 472 was not around in the latter portion of those years. And I'll also say it has to be the carbureted variants. No fuel-injected variants here of the Cadillac V8s, just the ones that were outfitted with the Rochester Quadrajet. And all of them were either outfitted with a Quadrajet or fuel injection. So why am I picking this? First, let's talk about carburation. The Quadrajet, I think, is the best carburetor ever made and put on an engine by a domestic automobile manufacturer. It's extremely reliable. It has these very small primaries, large secondaries, kind of brought the whole concept of the spread bore carburetor to a whole new level, extreme spread bore, with very little primaries that enabled great fuel economy, great atomization of fuel. And then if you really wanted to put your foot in it, you got all of that secondary, let's say, air and fuel. These carburetors were either 750 or 800 CFM. They flowed a lot. and a lot more than like Ford, the top carburetors from Ford in the era, unless you were getting a super high performance variant with the Autolite, with something other than the Autolite 4300 flowed 600 CFM. In fact, the 1967 variants of the Autolite 4300 just flowed 474 CFM. Pretty pathetic. But the Quadrajet, I think, was far more reliable than the carburetors from Ford, certainly the 4-barrels, and was more reliable than any of the carburetors, Holley or Carter, etc., that Chrysler was using. There's really only a couple drawbacks to the Quadrajets of this era, and one is that the fuel well is relatively small. So if you don't have a strong fuel pump or you're trying to do quarter-mile drag races, it might be a little tough. You might run out of fuel. In fact, Buick in 1970 outfitted their Riviera with an electronic fuel pump that could keep the Quadrajet float bowl in that area just full of fuel continuously, because that was an issue. I don't know why or what they thought 1970 Riviera owners were going to be doing, but that's a whole nother story. Aside from that, in some leakage in the well plugs, which you can easily correct, the Quadrajet is just fantastic, and the engines that use it get great mileage. The GM ignition systems of the time, I would say, also were fantastic. The HEI setup was the most reliable of any of the electronic ignitions. Hot rodders still use it today. It did have some issues with the modules under the distributors in some cases, but overall very, very reliable. And if you have them with the points-based setup, GM had a great setup where you have the little window in the distributor cap where you can adjust the points without taking the cap off. I mean, what a great idea. Unfortunately, you got to set the gap on the Fords and the Chryslers with a feeler gauge, and it's a little bit hard to get the dwell exactly right. I find it's best to set the dwell while you're cranking the engine with a little trigger, particularly on the Fords, and crank it and take a look at the dwell. But the GMs are very easy. If the dwell gets out of tune, you just rotate, put your Allen key in there, and you can get the dwell back to where it needs to be. So great advantages on the ignition front and the carburation front. And then the Cadillac engines themselves, they had very high nickel content. They wore extremely well. They just were engines that did not wear out. They did not have 4-bolt main bearings, but this was not a high revving engine, never meant to be a high revving engine. They are silky smooth. They don't have water pump issues. In fact, I don't think I've ever replaced a factory water pump on a Cadillac V8, a 472 or 500 that I've owned, ever. They all have the stock water pump from the factory all these years later, and you cannot say that about virtually any other domestic V8 engine, where water pumps in some cases, I mentioned, like the Chevrolet small block, just tend to wear out pretty frequently. The starters also seem to last a long period of time. I'm trying to think if I've ever had to replace a starter on a Cadillac V8, and I don't think I have. I've replaced a ton of Pontiac V8 starters in my time. I've replaced quite a few Chevrolet V8 starters. I've replaced some Olds and Buick, but not as frequently. But the Cadillac starters, I don't know what they did with Delco Remy division. I have a lot of luck with the Cadillac starters, more so than any other type of V8. And these engines just don't have problems. They really don't have much in the way of valve train problems or oiling problems or cylinder wear problems, main bearing problems. They're just very, very reliable. And the great thing is, because they were Cadillacs, and the Cadillacs were often equipped with automatic climate control, they have huge radiators and cooling systems. They don't overheat when they're tuned properly. The engines don't even get hot on the hottest days. So you've got a great, reliable cooling system, a far better cooling system than, I would say, a lot of the Ford big blocks. Like a lot of Ford big blocks of the era, the 429s, the 460s, even if you got air conditioning, they just had a 2-row radiator. The Cadillacs had big, massive 3-row radiators to cool the engines. I think some of the largest radiators, period. Ford seemed to skimp on cooling a little bit. Even the transmission oil coolers in Fords for the C6s are not really all that robust. If you compare a Ford transmission oil cooler to a GM transmission oil cooler, It's not even close. The GM is far more robust and can flow a lot more coolant. So everything around the Cadillac V8 too is just well built, well engineered, made to last. And for that reason, if I had to pick a classic car to go cross country, all other things equal, I would pick a Cadillac of that era. And I've only talked about a few V8 engines. There are obviously others, the Nailhead from Buick before the engine that came out in 1967. There were a number of variations of Pontiac V8s and Olds V8s and other Ford and Chrysler V8 engines that I didn't mention. But I don't think that anything for reliability tops the Cadillac 472 and 500 from 1968 to 1976. And I would also say that statement holds true even if I compare versus the Chevrolet big block as an example and any of the small block V8s that I didn't mention. Great engines, although some of the Buick small blocks seemingly like to grenade a little bit. But I would just overall say the Cadillac V8 is the pinnacle. Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks again for watching.